Get him out before Atlas breaks his arm. Nora Bennett's voice cut across the kennel yard as the fifth handler lost his footing, one gloved hand trapped beneath the lead. The Belgian Malinois did not bite. He twisted once, pinned the man's wrist against the concrete, then released the instant Nora opened the medical bay door. 4 other military working dogs stood behind Atlas in rigid silence, all facing the same direction. Not toward the handler. Toward the infirmary. Colonel Ethan Hale raised one hand, stopping 2 kennel technicians from rushing in with catch poles. The immediate goal had been simple: pair each dog with a qualified replacement handler before the transport review that afternoon. Instead, 5 experienced handlers had been rejected in less than 40 minutes. One had a dislocated thumb. Another had needed stitches. If the next controlled introduction failed, the dogs would be classified as unsafe to reassign, separated, and transferred to different facilities. Clear the yard, Ethan ordered. The injured handler stumbled through the gate, anger burning through his embarrassment. Nora caught him by the elbow, guided him onto a bench, and checked the hand Atlas had trapped. No punctures. No crushing injury. The dog had applied only enough pressure to stop the approach. He had my arm, the handler said through clenched teeth. He could have taken it. But he didn't. Nora tested the man's fingers one at a time. He controlled you, then released when the doorway opened. Ethan heard her. You think that makes him safe? Nora looked through the chain-link gate. Atlas had already returned to the others. 5 dogs, shoulder to shoulder, leaving an empty space between Atlas and the kennel wall. Their ears tracked boots, voices, and rattling equipment, but their bodies remained oriented toward the medical building. No, sir, she said. I think it makes him deliberate. Ethan stepped closer, his pale face set with the impatience of an officer watching a deadline collapse. He had spent 6 weeks bringing in handlers with patrol, detection, and combat tracking experience. The dogs had refused food from them, ignored commands, and blocked anyone who tried to divide the group. Today's forced pairings had been his last authorized option. They rejected everyone, he said. What exactly are you seeing that my trainers aren't? Nora finished wrapping the handler's wrist before answering. She had learned not to speak faster simply because someone outranked her. Their weight is forward, but their tails aren't tucked. No fixed stare. No pursuit after release. They aren't trying to drive people out of the yard. She pointed without approaching the fence. Watch the spacing. 1 technician moved along the outside perimeter. 10 eyes followed him, but no dog broke position. Then a medic crossed the infirmary doorway behind Nora. All 5 dogs rose half an inch on their front paws. Atlas shifted left. The others adjusted with him, preserving the same open space in their line. The change was small, synchronized, and impossible to dismiss. Ethan's attention moved from their paws to the gap. A missing dog? Too wide. Nora measured it against the width of her own shoulders. That position is for a person. The handler beside her stopped arguing. Inside the yard, Atlas sat. 4 dogs followed in sequence, still facing the infirmary, still guarding the empty place. Nora felt an unexpected pressure beneath her ribs. This was not refusal without purpose. Every snapped lead, untouched bowl, and blocked gate had served the same decision. They're holding formation, she said quietly. They're waiting for someone to come through that door. Ethan studied the dogs for several seconds, then turned to the technicians. Cancel the next pairing. No catch poles, no sedation, and nobody separates them tonight. That was not trust in Nora. It was a change forced by observable behavior, and it carried a cost. Ethan removed the transfer order from his clipboard, drew a line through the afternoon deadline, and wrote a new one beneath it. 72 hours. After that, he said, transport takes all 5. Different facilities. He handed Nora the observation log instead of returning it to the kennel supervisor. You identified the pattern. You document it, and you help determine what breaks it without getting anyone else hurt. Nora accepted the clipboard. The assignment placed 5 military dogs, 5 future placements, and Ethan's final extension partly in her hands. She had come outside to treat an injured handler. Now, when she stepped back toward the infirmary, 20 paws moved with her on the other side of the fence, and stopped when she stopped. What would 72 hours demand of her? Nora carried the observation log into the infirmary and positioned a chair beside the window facing the kennel yard. She did not try to approach the 5 dogs again. Instead, she turned off the radio, asked the night medic to use the rear exit, and began recording every change in their formation against the ordinary rhythm of the building. At 9:10, a supply cart rattled past the window. 10 ears turned, but no paws moved. At 9:34, a kennel technician placed food inside the gate. The dogs ignored him and kept the open position between Atlas and the wall. At 10:02, Nora crossed the lighted doorway carrying folded blankets. All 5 rose together. They sat when she disappeared from view. This was not the broad behavioral reading that had stopped the forced pairings. Nora needed to learn what the formation required before the deadline reduced 5 living animals to separate transport numbers. She drew 6 circles on a blank page, measured the open position against the concrete seams, then changed one variable at a time. She removed her white nursing jacket and crossed the doorway in dark scrubs. The dogs still rose. She asked the night medic to wear the jacket. They watched him but remained seated. She carried a meal tray, then an empty medical bag. Neither object changed their response. At midnight, Nora walked from the infirmary toward the kennel and stopped 20 feet from the fence. Atlas stood first. The others followed in sequence, but none crowded the gate. Their bodies angled to preserve the open place, as if her approach mattered and her position was still wrong. Ethan emerged from the administrative building with 2 cups of coffee and found her kneeling beside strips of tape laid across the pavement. "You're mapping their sight lines?" he asked. "Their spacing." Nora accepted neither cup. Her fingers were cold enough to stiffen around the pen. "They respond to me, but they aren't asking me to enter. They're expecting a specific movement." Ethan studied the log. Every observation had a time, distance, stimulus, and measurable response. Nora had also marked the dog's breathing, food refusal, and the order in which they stood. What movement? A return to formation. She placed her finger on the 6th circle. Every handler has approached them as 5 separate assignments. If they believe there's still one working element, each introduction has demanded that they abandon the others. And forcing another introduction confirms that people entering the yard intend to break them apart. Ethan looked toward the kennel. Atlas watched them without pulling against the fence. 72 hours no longer felt generous. Each failed test could make the final separation more dangerous and more traumatic. "What do you need?" he asked. It was the first time he had asked for her plan instead of asking her to defend an observation. No handler trials. No individual feeding. No commands unless safety requires one. Give me one uninterrupted night to learn the routine they're protecting. Ethan's jaw tightened. Suspending evaluations meant losing an entire shift inside a deadline he had personally authorized. If Nora's theory failed, his staff would have fewer hours to prepare 5 separate transfers. He took the radio from his belt. "Kennel team, suspend all pairing protocols until 0600. Maintain perimeter support only. Bennett controls contact." He then handed her the radio. The weight of it settled into her palm more heavily than the clipboard had. Ethan was not merely watching her work now. He had changed his team's plan around her judgment and made her responsible for what happened inside the silence she had requested. Nora returned to the infirmary before dawn to compare the night's final entries. 20 paws paced beside her beyond the fence, matching her speed without barking or breaking formation. She slowed. They slowed. At the kennel gate, she turned toward them, expecting Atlas to close the remaining distance. He stopped at the threshold. The other four aligned behind him, leaving the sixth position open on the yard side of the gate. Nora stepped backward. They followed. She stepped toward the infirmary. They followed again, yet none crossed the boundary separating them from her. Ethan watched from beside the control panel. "They'll move with you," he said. Nora closed the log, but her hand remained pressed against its cover. "Only if I stay outside what they're waiting for." The test had given them their first usable path forward, but it had also narrowed the problem around her. These dogs were not waiting for any qualified handler, and they were not simply waiting near the infirmary. They were measuring Nora against an unfinished place in their formation. At 0600, Ethan disabled the automatic handler schedule and assigned her sole authority over the next contact. Nora looked at the gate, then at the 5 dogs holding space for someone who had not returned. By the next test, observation would no longer be enough. She would have to decide whether to step into that empty place herself. "Open the gate," Nora said, before caution could become another excuse to wait. Ethan kept one hand above the control panel. "Once you cross that threshold, I can't guarantee they'll let you back out. If you send anyone in after me, they'll read it as another attempt to separate them." Nora placed the radio beside the observation log, removed her white jacket, and unclipped the empty treat pouch a technician had given her. She left the leash, bite sleeve, and catch pole untouched. 5 Military K9s watched each object fall away. None moved. "No equipment?" Ethan asked. "Equipment tells them what I expect them to become." Nora faced the gate. "I need them to show me what they already are." Ethan keyed in the release code. The lock struck open with a metallic snap, and Atlas rose immediately. Nora waited until all 4 other dogs had matched him. Their formation told her where pressure would come from before teeth or muscle ever did. Atlas guarded the opening. The shepherd on his right watched Ethan. The other 3 protected the empty 6th position. Nora entered sideways, keeping her hands visible and her pace even. She did not speak to them, reach toward them, or claim the space they had preserved. Ethan closed the gate behind her. Nora stopped 8 feet inside. Atlas lowered his head, not in submission but concentration. His weight shifted forward. The shepherd nearest the wall moved half a step to narrow Nora's path. She could have retreated. Instead, she made a choice that drew a sharp breath from the technician outside. Nora turned her back on all 5 dogs. She lowered herself to the concrete, folded one leg beneath her, and placed her open hands on her knees. By refusing to face them like a challenger or invite them like a new handler, she removed the conflict they had rejected for 6 weeks. But the formation remained locked. Nora studied their shadows on the concrete rather than turning around. Atlas's ears flicked at the ventilation fan. Another dog adjusted on the 4th scrape of a loose kennel chain. 4 beats, a pause, then 2. The pattern repeated when they settled, 4 footfalls, silence, 2 more. Nora's right hand tightened once. Then she lowered 2 fingers to the floor. Tap. 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 She waited through one measured breath. Tap. Tap. It was not a command. It was a field evacuation cadence, simple enough to carry through darkness when voices could not. Atlas's breathing changed first. The rapid panting stopped. Behind Nora, nails clicked against concrete, but she did not turn. One dog approached her left shoulder, close enough that warm breath moved the fabric of her scrub top. Another passed on her right. Neither touched her. They circled once, inspected her empty hands, then settled facing outward instead of pinning her between them. The formation had opened without breaking. Ethan lifted the radio, then deliberately lowered it. No intervention. No congratulation. He signaled the technician to step away from the emergency release and let Nora's decision stand. Atlas remained behind her. Nora heard him cross to the covered sleeping bay and nose aside a rubber mat. He returned carrying something made of scorched canvas. He placed it between Nora's shoes with such care that the buckles barely sounded against the floor. A medical field bag. One corner had burned black, and the faded fabric carried 5 parallel marks where it had been dragged or carried repeatedly. Atlas touched it once with his nose, then stepped back into the open position. Nora looked down. Her fingers hovered over the damaged strap, perfectly steady until she recognized the knot securing it. Then her thumb folded into her palm. She did not open the bag. The dogs had not accepted her as their handler, but they had trusted her with the object around which their waiting had formed. That was the first real boundary they had surrendered, and it made withdrawal more difficult than entry. Nora rose slowly, leaving the bag on the concrete. All 5 dogs remained calm. Ethan opened the gate only after she reached it on her own. When she emerged, he took the handler roster from the technician and signed across the remaining appointments. "All outside evaluations are suspended," he said. He assigned perimeter safety to the kennel team, gave Nora the only active access card, and ordered that no one enter without her approval. His behavior had changed because the dogs had changed: controlled breathing, open movement, no defensive compression, and voluntary release of a guarded object. Nora closed her hand around the access card. Independent contact gave her the chance to prevent 5 transfers, but it also made every decision inside that kennel hers. Through the fence, Atlas rested one paw on the scorched medical bag. Nora had entered to test whether the dogs would make room for her. They had answered by placing what they had protected at her feet, and now she would have to decide how much of herself she was willing to place beside it. Atlas lifted his paw from the scorched medical bag only when Nora reached for the kennel access card, forcing her to decide whether accepting control meant using it immediately. She entered alone, collected the untouched feeding pans, and checked each dog without attempting physical contact. 4 portions remained intact. The 5th, belonging to a sable shepherd named Echo, had not been disturbed since the previous afternoon. His gums were moist, his breathing steady, and his abdomen showed no visible swelling, but he stayed curled beside the empty 6th position while the others formed a loose barrier around him. Nora placed fresh food 6 feet away. Echo turned his head. Atlas watched him, then stepped back from his own pan. Within seconds, the other 3 did the same. Their loyalty was becoming a medical risk. If Echo refuses another meal, veterinary protocol allows chemical restraint for examination, Ethan said from beyond the fence. Nora looked at the 5 bowls and then at the scorched bag. Sedation might let the veterinarian rule out illness, but restraining one dog would confirm the threat the group had resisted from the beginning: separation by force. Waiting carried its own danger. If Echo weakened, all 5 could follow him into physical decline before the transfer deadline. "He needs to eat," Nora said. "But not as an individual." Ethan studied the kennel clock. Nora had already proven that the dogs could lower their defenses around her. That success now made her accountable for choosing what happened when trust and medical safety pulled in opposite directions. He called the veterinary team and delayed sedation for 24 hours, keeping them on standby rather than dismissing them. "I'll carry the protocol decision," he told her. "You carry what happens in here." Nora nodded once. Shared responsibility did not make the choice lighter. It removed her last excuse to remain only an observer. She moved the 5 pans into a shallow arc, then stopped. The arrangement was correct for kennel feeding and wrong for the dogs in front of her. Their eyes kept returning to the unoccupied space, and the burned field bag lay at its edge like a boundary marker. Nora gathered the pans again. This time, she placed them in a tight defensive circle facing outward, each within sight of the others. She filled a 6th metal pan with water, carried it into the empty position, and sat behind it with her back exposed to the group. No command. No coaxing. She simply waited. Atlas approached first, but he did not eat. His nose touched the edge of Nora's water pan. Nora rested 2 fingers against the concrete and tapped 4 times, paused, then twice, the same cadence that had opened their formation. She did not repeat it. Echo's ears rose. He unfolded slowly, crossed behind Atlas, and stood over his food. Still, he waited. Nora understood the cost of the next action before she took it. If she completed a routine they recognized, she would no longer be testing their behavior from a professional distance. She would be placing herself inside the role holding them together, strengthening an attachment she might later have to break. Her hand tightened around the rim of the 6th pan. Then she raised it, took one deliberate drink, and set it down. Echo lowered his head and ate. Atlas followed. The remaining dogs began in order, maintaining the outward-facing circle until every pan was empty. No one outside celebrated. Ethan quietly cancelled the sedation order and instructed the kennel team to preserve Nora's arrangement for all future meals. He also directed them to route every change in feeding, access, or handling through her. The dogs had stabilized, but the result narrowed their options again. They would accept care only when Nora occupied the place they had kept open. After the meal, she stood and lifted one leash from the wall. Atlas moved between her and the clip. He did not threaten her, he pressed his shoulder against her knee and held the line. Echo joined him, followed by the other 3. They would eat with Nora inside their formation, but they would not permit her to lead one dog away from it. She returned the leash to its hook. Behind her, Ethan removed the transfer preparation schedule from the kennel board and replaced it with a handwritten deadline, 24 hours to establish voluntary movement as a group. Nora remained beside the 6th pan after the others had gone. Her choice had protected their health and earned another day, yet it had also made her presence part of the condition keeping them stable. When she finally stepped toward the gate, 5 bodies rose with her. She could no longer save them by standing outside there waiting. From that moment forward, every path out would require her to enter it more completely. The 5 dogs would follow Nora only as a unit, so she had 24 hours to give them a reason to move without asking them to abandon the place they guarded. She stood beneath the leash rack, looking from Atlas's shoulder against her knee to the scorched medical bag near the 6th pan. Standard leads had turned every handler into a threat. Food had stabilized the dogs but tied that stability to her presence. If she tried another ordinary method, she would spend the remaining hours proving what they had already made clear. Keep the kennel closed for 40 minutes, she told Ethan. Where are you going? To get something I promised myself I would never use again. Ethan could have demanded an explanation before allowing the only authorized contact to leave. Instead, he took the active access card from her, stepped between the technicians and the gate, and assumed responsibility for maintaining the exact conditions she had established. 40 minutes, he said. Nora crossed the base to her quarters and pulled a locked military storage case from beneath her bed. Dust marked the floor where it had remained untouched for 6 years. She sat beside it with the key between her fingers, unable to fit it into the lock on the first attempt. Opening the case would not simply expose equipment. It would surrender the quiet boundary between the nurse she had become and the work she had survived. Behind the lid were 5 collar covers, their canvas edges darkened by heat, and a compact brass whistle engraved with Mercy, 6. Nora did not touch the whistle. She gathered the collar covers and returned to the kennel with the case locked beneath one arm. Ethan saw the military stitching and cleared the observation area without asking anyone to identify it. When they were alone, Nora knelt outside the gate and arranged the 5 covers on the concrete. Atlas's ears rose. Echo left the empty position for the first time and approached the fence. The other 3 followed, not crowding forward but aligning in a narrow column. Their attention was no longer fixed on the infirmary. It was fixed on what Nora had brought back. Those belonged to them, Ethan said. Not exactly. Nora ran her thumb over a repaired seam. They belonged to the formation they were trained to return with. She opened the gate, carried the covers inside, and laid one before each dog. Rather than attempting to fasten them, she waited. Atlas lowered his nose to the first strip of canvas, then pushed it toward Nora. Consent, not compliance. She secured it around his existing collar, checked that 2 fingers fit beneath it, and repeated the process only when each dog offered the same movement. Ethan watched the order, the pauses, and the absence of spoken commands. This was not familiarity with kennel management. Nora was rebuilding a recovery sequence the dogs already understood. She took 5 leads from the wall and clipped them together through a single load-rated ring, creating one flexible line rather than 5 competing points of control. Then she placed the ring on the ground. "Return formation," she said softly. Atlas picked up the joined ring. Echo moved beside him. The others formed around a scorched medical bag until Atlas lifted it by its strap and carried it himself. Nora walked backward toward the open gate, giving them the choice to stop. 5 dogs crossed the kennel yard together. They passed the feeding station, the examination marker, and every place where previous handlers had lost control. At the threshold, Atlas placed the ring in Nora's hand. For the first time in 6 weeks, all 5 Military K9s left their enclosure voluntarily. The practical problem had changed. They could move safely as a group, and separation was no longer the only transport option. Yet when Nora turned toward the exercise yard, they did not follow. They formed a protective arc around her, facing outward, while preserving the same empty 6th position at her back. She had restored movement, but not completed the return they believed they were making. Ethan closed the kennel gate and cancelled the separate transport crates. Then he handed Nora the movement plan and the authority to approve every handler contact. "No one takes control of that line unless you authorize it," he said. His trust was now operational, visible, and costly to both of them. Nora stared at the 5 joined leads in her hand. "You should know what you're assigning." She told him only what the dogs had already forced her actions to prove. She had served as a military recovery medic attached to working dog teams, trained to bring entire elements home when handlers could not. She did not give him a unit, rank, or operation. She did not need to. "I left that work 6 years ago," she said. "I thought these 5 never came back." Ethan's expression tightened, but he did not turn her confession into a question. He secured the access log inside his jacket and assumed responsibility for protecting the contact window from interruption. "Then decide what they need now," he said. Nora looked down at the locked case. Using the whistle inside might complete the sequence, or bind the dogs more deeply to a role she no longer knew she could carry. She had saved their chance to remain together by giving up her anonymity, and success had removed her final route back to being only their nurse. With the joined leads wrapped around her hand and 5 dogs waiting for her next decision, Nora carried the case into the kennel and asked Ethan to lock the gate behind her. Nora set the locked case on the concrete, but when her thumb touched the latch, all 5 dogs abandoned the outward arc and closed around the empty 6th position. Atlas still held the joined lead ring. He did not offer it to her this time. The message was clear: movement alone was not enough, and using the wrong signal could harden 6 years of waiting into something no handler could undo. Beyond the gate, Ethan's radio sounded. The transport team had advanced collection to dawn because the separate crates were no longer required. Nora now had less than 6 hours to complete a voluntary transfer as one unit, or the dogs would be removed under restraint. Ethan silenced the radio and faced her. "Can the whistle bring them through?" Nora looked at the case. "It can start a recovery sequence. If I sound it without knowing which role they expect me to fill, they may follow the signal and reject the person holding it. You. Or what they remember through me." She could protect them from forced separation by using the authority they had begun granting her, but if that authority rested on an unfinished bond, every step forward might attach them more firmly to someone who had spent 6 years refusing to return. Ethan opened the gate and entered without reaching for the joined leads. The dogs tracked him but did not challenge his presence because Nora remained inside their formation. He placed the amended movement order on the case. "I can request a command hold until noon." If I sign it, the delay becomes my responsibility, and so does any injury during removal. Nora met his eyes. If I fail, you lose control of what happens next. Then don't choose based on what it costs me. Ethan signed before she could answer. He carried the order outside himself, preventing the kennel team from interrupting the contact window and accepting the professional risk she had been carrying alone. His decision gave Nora time, but it also took away the excuse of an impossible deadline. She knelt and unlocked the case. The brass whistle lay beside a compact field recorder she had packed without ever playing again. Its casing was scarred, its battery long dead, but the memory card remained sealed beneath a rubber cover. Nora's hand stopped above it. The dogs had protected a medical bag, preserved a sixth position, and responded to a recovery cadence. If the last recorded transmission contained the missing instruction, listening could free them. It could also remove the version of the past that had allowed her to believe nothing remained for her to finish. She brought the recorder to the infirmary's workbench while Ethan connected the memory card to an offline audio unit. No archive search. No personnel file. Only the final minutes already in Nora's possession. She returned to the kennel before pressing play, because whatever the dogs heard had to be measured in the present. Static filled the small speaker. Atlas stiffened. Nora immediately lowered the volume and sat beside the sixth pan rather than forcing him through the sound. A strained voice emerged beneath the interference, followed by a burst of noise and the rapid breathing of someone still trying to keep order. The speaker called the dogs by name. One by one, 5 heads lifted. Then came the command Nora remembered: hold formation. Her breath shortened as the recording continued beyond the point where memory had always ended. The voice did not call the handlers back. It repeated a designation between broken transmissions. Mercy 6, receive the element. Mercy 6, bring them home. Atlas released the joined ring at Nora's feet. Echo moved to her left, and the other 3 settled around her without closing the empty position. They were not waiting for any of the 5 handlers who had died. The final instruction had transferred responsibility to someone outside that casualty list, someone expected to recognize the formation, the medical bag, the cadence, and the whistle. Nora stopped the recording before the last transmission could repeat. Her fingers shook once, then closed around the brass whistle. Ethan did not ask what Mercy 6 meant. He unlocked the gate, laid all 5 leads in a straight line across the threshold, and removed every restraint tool from the entry path. At noon, they must choose whether to cross, he said. So must you. Nora could still protect her quiet life by admitting she was too entangled to continue, but that choice would leave the dogs waiting until strangers removed them by force. She fastened the whistle around her neck and handed Ethan her infirmary badge. Cover my shift, she said. Until this is finished. It was the first commitment she had made without leaving herself a professional role to retreat into. As Ethan closed the outer yard and placed the signed delay order against the glass, Nora took the scorched medical bag from Atlas and stepped into the 6th position. 5 Military K9s turned toward her together. The next time that gate opened, she would have to answer the call they had obeyed for 6 years. Nora raised the brass whistle, then stopped before it reached her lips. The 5 dogs had not spent 6 years waiting for a sound. They had waited for someone to accept what the sound required. She lowered it and looked through the fence at Ethan. Open both gates. The outer gate led beyond the kennel yard to the secured exercise lane. Crossing it voluntarily would prove the dogs could be moved without restraint, but leaving both barriers open meant Ethan's team could not contain them if Nora lost control. He considered the 5 loose leads across the threshold, then ordered every technician behind the perimeter line. He disabled the automatic locks, opened the inner gate, and walked to the outer one himself. The lane is yours, he said. It was not permission from a safe distance. By remaining at the final gate, Ethan accepted the risk of her decision with her. Nora placed the scorched medical bag over her shoulder. Atlas watched the strap settle against her side. Echo looked toward the empty 6th position. The other three held their places, waiting for the sequence to continue. Nora could sound the whistle and make herself a temporary instrument of their training, preserving the quiet life she had built by treating this as one final procedure. But the recording had made that refuge impossible. The last instruction had not been directed to a piece of equipment. It had entrusted 5 lives to a person. She stepped fully into the open position and faced the same direction as the dogs. Mercy 6 receiving, she said, her voice low but steady. 5 accounted for. Atlas released the joined lead ring at her boots. Nora did not pick it up. A shared ring could move them as a formation, but it could not answer the choice each dog had refused to make for every other handler. She separated the 5 leads and laid one in front of each animal. Then she backed away, leaving the clips beside their collars and the handles pointing toward her. No command compelled them forward. No closed gate prevented retreat. You waited long enough, she whispered. Choose. Atlas approached first. He stepped over his lead, stopped within reach, and lowered his head. Nora clipped the line to his collar cover. Echo followed, then the 2 shepherds and the second Malinois, each crossing the concrete alone before returning to formation beside her. The act was quiet, deliberate, and unmistakable. 5 Military K9s that had rejected every qualified handler had voluntarily placed their leads in the hands of the nurse they had been waiting for. Nora gathered the handles without winding them around her wrist. She gave them room to refuse what came next. The outer gate stood open 50 feet away. Ethan remained beside it, hands empty, while the transport clock reached noon behind the observation glass. Nora lifted the whistle and sounded the recovery cadence, for clear notes, a measured pause, then 2. The dogs did not surge or pull. They turned with her. Nora took 1 step. 20 paws moved. At the inner threshold, Atlas hesitated and looked back toward the kennel, the 6th pan, and the place where the scorched bag had remained guarded for years. Nora felt the leads tighten by less than an inch. She did not pull. Instead, she removed the infirmary badge Ethan had returned to her and set it beside the 6th pan. The gesture cost her the last boundary she had kept. She was not crossing as a nurse conducting an assessment, and she would not retreat into that role if the return became painful. She adjusted the medical bag and spoke the sentence the lost team had trusted her to finish. Return formation. Bring everyone home. Atlas crossed. Echo moved beside him. The remaining dogs followed Nora through the inner gate, down the lane, and across the outer threshold without restraint. Ethan closed the gate only after the final tail cleared it, then cancelled the separation order and signed Nora's name onto the voluntary transfer record as the receiving specialist. There was no applause. Nora sank to one knee because her legs could no longer hide what the choice had taken from her. Atlas placed the joined ring in her lap, but she opened it again and returned 1 lead to each dog. They were not relics to be bound forever to one loss. For now, however, they leaned against her shoulders and knees, 5 living weights confirming that their wait was over. Ethan picked up her infirmary badge but did not hand it back. What happens to them next is your decision, he said. Nora looked at the dogs gathered around her, then accepted the transfer documents instead. She had discovered who they were waiting for. By leading them through the gate, she had also accepted who she would have to become for them now. Ethan left the transfer documents in Nora's hands and moved first, lowering the portable barriers so the 5 dogs could enter the recovery yard without being funneled into another enclosure. He told the waiting kennel technicians to remove the separate crates, then carried Nora's infirmary badge to the duty desk instead of returning it to her. No one reached for the leads. No one called the dogs by command. The space around Nora remained open by deliberate choice. Atlas leaned against her shoulder until her breathing steadied, then rose and shook the tension from his coat. The others followed him toward the water station, still moving as one body, but no longer guarding the 6th position. Echo drank first. 1 shepherd lay in the sun. The second Malinois wandered 3 steps from the group to inspect Ethan's boots, then returned without being called. Small distances, freely chosen. Nora watched each one as carefully as she had watched their refusals. Ethan took the separation order from his folder, tore it through the signature line, and placed the pieces inside the canceled transport crate. Then he brought her a blank rehabilitation plan. The section marked receiving handler already carried Nora's name. She held the pen above it but did not sign. Atlas had waited 6 years to place his lead in her hand. Keeping all 5 beside her would have felt like loyalty. It also would have made their future depend upon her never leaving again. Nora knelt and unclipped the scorched collar cover from Atlas. His ears shifted back, but she did not soothe him with a promise she could not guarantee. She laid the cover beside the medical bag and offered him her empty palm. He pressed his nose into it, then stepped away to join Echo at the water. "They chose you," Ethan said quietly. Nora looked at the 5 separate leads lying across the grass. "They chose the person assigned to bring them home. That doesn't mean home has to end with me." Her hand tightened around the unsigned plan. "If I keep them because I'm afraid to lose them again, I turn their loyalty into another kind of waiting." Ethan took the form from her, crossed out receiving handler, and wrote transition director in its place. He then removed his own name from final placement authority and signed that responsibility over to Nora. It was not a decoration or an honorary role. It gave her the power to reject qualified candidates, extend recovery, preserve the dogs as a unit during transition, and require every future bond to be voluntary. "Then choose the people who understand that," he said. Nora read the amended line twice. Accepting meant remaining on the base beyond the deadline, surrendering the quiet schedule she had built in the infirmary, and preparing for 5 separate goodbyes. Refusing meant preserving herself at the cost of leaving the dog's next relationships to the same process they had already rejected. She signed. Ethan signed beneath her, sharing accountability for every delay her standards might create. He walked to the observation line, where the 5 previously selected handlers were waiting for instructions, and removed the numbered assignment cards from their hands. Instead of sending them toward individual dogs, he asked them to sit along the fence with their leashes on the ground and make no attempt at contact. One handler started to call Atlas. Ethan stopped him with a quiet shake of his head. "They decide the distance." Then he returned to the yard and sat several feet from Nora, not between her and the dogs, not above her with a clipboard. For the first time, he waited under the same rules she had asked everyone else to follow. Minutes passed. Echo left the water station and approached the fence. A handler nearest him kept both hands resting on his knees. He did not offer food or speak a command. When Echo paused, the man turned his shoulder slightly, giving him room to withdraw. Echo remained. Nora's fingers moved toward the whistle at her chest, then stopped. She let her hand fall. This choice belonged to them. Atlas settled beside her, but his gaze stayed on Echo. When Echo finally lay down across from the waiting handler, Atlas did not call him back into formation. He placed one paw over Nora's shoe and watched. Ethan opened the rehabilitation log and wrote the first entry himself, voluntary proximity, no demand made. He passed the pen to Nora without taking the book from her. She added the time, then rested the log between them. Nothing had been completed, and no bond had been promised. Yet one dog had chosen a distance the others allowed him to keep, one handler had accepted patience over control, and one commander had changed the process instead of asking the dogs to change first. Nora stayed seated as the afternoon light stretched across the 5 unused leads. She would remain until each dog could pick one up for someone new, and when that day came, she would not ask any of them to wait for her. Echo's handler stayed beside the fence after the light began to fade, making no move to shorten the distance Echo had chosen. When the dog finally rose, the man reached for neither leash nor food. He opened his palm against the grass and waited. Echo crossed the last few feet on his own and rested his chin there. Ethan recorded the contact, but he left the next decision to Nora. She placed Echo's unused lead between them. The handler looked at her, then pushed it gently toward the dog instead of taking it. Echo examined the handle, picked it up, and laid it across the man's knee. That became the standard for every pairing that followed. No assignments by kennel number. No forced proximity. Each candidate waited outside the formation until one of the dogs chose to close the distance. When a handler grew impatient, Ethan removed him from consideration before Nora had to intervene. When another dog withdrew after an encouraging first contact, Ethan erased the expected timeline rather than treating hesitation as failure. Weeks passed within that slower rhythm. Echo chose first. The two shepherds followed on different days. The second Malinois made one candidate sit through 6 silent mornings before placing a lead at her feet. Each new bond loosened the old formation without breaking it. Atlas remained beside Nora. Months after the kennel gate had first opened for her, 5 dogs returned to the recovery yard with 5 handlers walking several paces behind them. No one held a leash. Nora stood near the same threshold where the dogs had once faced the infirmary and guarded an empty position. The scorched medical bag rested beside the 5 burned collar covers. The Mercy 6 whistle hung against her scrubs. Ethan handed the rehabilitation log to Echo's handler and stepped away. The man checked each team's spacing, then noticed the newest handler reaching toward her dog before the animal had settled. He raised one hand, stopping her without embarrassment or command. Then he sat on the concrete himself. She understood, lowered herself beside him, and waited until the dog chose to lean against her leg. Nora watched from the gate without being asked to approve what they had done. Ethan had given them the responsibility, and they were carrying it for one another. 4 dogs moved to their handlers. Atlas stayed with Nora, his lead on the ground between his front paws. She knelt and removed the Mercy 6 whistle. Her thumb passed once over the engraving before she placed it beside the burned collars. Then she unclipped Atlas's scorched cover and set it with the others. The old objects no longer had to tell him where he belonged. Nora touched 2 fingers to the concrete. 4 quiet taps. A pause. 2 more. Atlas lifted his head. "You're home," she said. She did not pick up his lead. His new handler waited across the yard with both hands open and nothing concealed in them. Atlas pressed his forehead briefly against Nora's shoulder, then stepped back. He lifted the lead that he had once surrendered only to her, carried it across the old 6th position, and placed it in the other woman's palm. Nora's hand remained suspended for a moment after his warmth had left it. Ethan came to stand beside her, close enough to share the silence without filling the space Atlas had vacated. He held out her infirmary badge in one hand and the rehabilitation log in the other. Nora took both. She clipped the badge back onto her scrubs, then gave the log to Echo's handler, leaving its next blank page in his care. 5 handlers opened the gate together. 5 Military K9s looked back once, not for permission and not because they were still waiting. Nora gave no command. Atlas turned first, and the others followed the people they had chosen into the morning. Ethan remained beside Nora as she walked toward the infirmary, while behind them the empty 6th position disappeared beneath 10 sets of willing footsteps.